It was the spring of 1949. The fields near Camp Dodge, Iowa were just beginning to green up after a long Midwestern winter. Life in the countryside moved at its usual slow rhythm, marked by the routines of planting season, Sunday church bells, and neighbors who rarely locked their doors. But that sense of peace would be shattered on a quiet stretch of land near the military base when two elderly residents were found brutally murdered in their home. The crime would shock the community and leave behind questions that decades later still linger in the shadows of the cornfields. This is the story of Claud and Anne Miller. Hello, friends. My name is Marcia, and this is Midwest Murders. Camp Dodge, located near Johnston, Iowa, just northwest of Des Moines, was an important military training facility with deep roots in American military history. By 1949, Camp Dodge had transitioned from its World War II peak operations into a quieter but still active role as a base for the Iowa National Guard. Although the military presence remained significant, the surrounding communities were largely rural, with small farms and close-knit neighborhoods dotting the landscape. In the post-war years, Iowa, like much of the country, was experiencing a period of transition. Veterans were returning home, industry was shifting gears from wartime production, and the early signs of suburban growth were emerging around cities like Des Moines. Despite this progress, rural areas like those near Camp Dodge remained deeply traditional. Life was slower, neighbors knew each other, and violent crime, especially something as shocking as murder, was rare and unsettling. 64-year-old Claud Miller and his 62-year-old wife Anna had lived most of their lives in the area and had moved to the small white frame house on Highway 141 just 2 miles north of Camp Dodge 5 weeks before their murder. They'd been married for 40 years and raised 2 children, a son Frank and a daughter Ruth. Frank, estranged from his wife Thelma for a year prior, was living with his parents. On Sunday, April 3, 1949, Frank had spent the evening at the Dodge Inn Tavern playing shuffleboard and drinking with friends. At around 3:15 a.m., he left the tavern, arriving home at 3:30, where he saw a light on in the basement. He went down to the basement to investigate and saw his mother's bloody body on the floor. Frank ran out of the house and immediately drove to the home of neighbors Virgil and Ted Miller, no relation, about a quarter of a mile away to summon help. Telling the Millers, "Daddy killed Mama," they called police. Deputy Sheriff Jim Mosier responded, and he and the Millers went with Frank back to the house, where they found Claud and Anne on the floor of the basement, with an empty shotgun on the floor halfway between them, and 2 discharged shells nearby. Claud was wearing work clothes, but was in his stocking feet. Anne was barefoot and had a dress on over her nightgown. Both had been killed by a 12-gauge shotgun blast between 3:30 and 4 a.m. Sheriff Howard Reppert initially doubted Frank's account that his father might have killed his mother and then taken his own life. Reppert believed someone had ejected the final shell and deliberately closed the shotgun after the shootings, which led him to suspect murder. However, tests later showed that due to the shotgun's age and condition, it would break open and eject a spent shell when fired or even dropped, just as Frank had described. Based on those findings, Sheriff Reppert revised his view and acknowledged that Claud's wounds could have been self-inflicted. As was custom of the day, an inquest was held and several witnesses came forward to testify. Frank's estranged wife Thelma claimed that Frank beat her and threatened to kill her. She testified that he always drank, but it became worse when he returned home from the Army in 1946. Richard and Jane Evans, owners of the Dodge Inn Tavern, testified that Frank was there from 9 p.m. Sunday until 3 a.m. Monday morning, confirming his alibi. Vern Bruce and Nicholas Thiessen, 2 customers also at the tavern that night, testified they played shuffleboard with Frank. They did not think he was intoxicated, but he had been drinking. Family members did report that Claud and Anne were not happy with Frank's drinking, and the parents and son often argued about it. Following witness testimony, the inquest jury returned a verdict that Claud and Anne were murdered by a party or parties unknown. As far as I can tell, 34-year-old Frank, who had drifted from job to job after leaving the Army, was the only person ever investigated as a suspect. He was taken into custody the night of the crime. He was finally charged with murder after 3 days of questioning. The Polk County grand jury would ultimately dismiss all charges against him, and he has always maintained his innocence. The funeral for Claud and Anne was held at the Boak Funeral Home in Hubbard, Iowa, officiated by the Reverend Dewey Lamprecht. 250 mostly elderly friends of the couple were in attendance, the largest crowd ever at the funeral home, and it overflowed onto the porch and lawn. They were laid to rest in the Hubbard Cemetery. Frank died in 1991 at the age of 74 in Faribault, Minnesota. Was this a double homicide or a murder-suicide? I don't know the answer, but it feels like another case where the authorities didn't dig deep enough to find out what really happened. Sheriff Reppert eventually confirmed Frank's claim that the shotgun was defective and admitted a murder-suicide was possible, yet Claude's death certificate still lists the cause of death as a homicide. In a place where violence was almost unheard of, the murder of Claud and Anne Miller left a scar that has never quite healed. The world has changed since 1949. Camp Dodge has evolved, technology has advanced, and small-town life in Iowa isn't what it used to be. But the story of that quiet farm couple and the brutal way their lives ended still echoes across the land they once called home. We remember them not just for how they died, but for the mystery that remains, reminding us that even the most peaceful places can hold the darkest secrets. If you have any thoughts or theories about this case, please leave them in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious, stay vigilant, and may the truth reveal itself in the shadows.